Hi, today we are going to talk about single subject, continue talking about single subject research designs, and specifically talk about alternating treatment designs and changing criterion designs. So, just as a review, we talked about the pre-experimental or ABA designs. That the downside of those, of course, being primarily that they don't demonstrate control. That is, they don't demonstrate a functional assessment between the independent variable, the intervention or the treatment, and the dependent variable or the target behavior. And we talked about withdrawal designs, or also known as reversals, multiple baselines last week. And this week we're going to finish it off with the alternating treatment designs and the changing criteria. Again, the goal is always with all of these to demonstrate a functional relationship. And the AB, unfortunately, although it may be all we can do in some cases, and it may suggest that there's some functional relationship, but it's really just correlational, and it does not demonstrate that. Okay. So the goal in an alternating treatments design is you compare the effects of two or more independent variables on the same dependent variables. So the effects of two or more treatments on the same target behavior. So let's think about the Awada functional analysis, where there were those four conventional interventions. Attention, where the individual got attention for engaging in self-injury. Escape, where they were allowed to escape contingent on self-injury. The alone condition, where there was no, or there wasn't a lot of external stimulation, and then a control condition. That's a great example of an alternating treatment design, where there, in that case, were four independent variables, four different kinds of interventions or treatments or assessments on the same dependent variable, which in this case, in Wada's case, was SIB. So, alternating treatment designs require the rapid alternation of two or more treatments, so you're going across treatments or sessions or different times of the day back and forth. So you expose them to, again, think about you read those articles, the Awada functional assessment article. You might go from an escape condition to a control condition to another escape to an attention condition to two alone conditions back to an escape condition. So you're going back and forth, and you run those, conduct those sessions one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other, and you really, in a particular day, can do as many as the individual can tolerate and you can tolerate. And then you compare different treatments, and because of that, typically you don't use a baseline comparison. So again, think back to Awada's data. There wasn't a baseline comparison. He just included a baseline condition. So, of course, like all these treatment designs, and like so much in applied behavior analysis, there's different names. And in some of the older articles that you will read, you'll see alternating treatment designs called multi-element. Some might call it a multiple schedule or alternating treatments design, but for the most part, you'll see either alternating treatment design is what is used primarily right now, but you will see multi-element. I think in Awada's original 1982 article on functional analysis, he referred to the design as a multi-element design. All right, so there's three types. There's the type with no baseline, like the Iwata one. You could have a baseline that is followed by an alternating treatment. That's nice. You could have a baseline followed by an alternating treatment and a final treatment phase. Even nicer. Just like the conversation we have been having with all of these designs, strength varies. And sure, number 3, a baseline followed by alternating treatments, followed by a final treatment phase, probably is going to have more power, that is, be more convincing than an alternating treatments with no baseline. However, an alternating treatments with no baseline, particularly if you include a baseline condition in the alternating treatments as one of the alternating treatments, certainly demonstrates a functional relationship. It controls for extraneous variables, so it's like, hey, it's a good design. But it could be stronger, just like with the reversal designs. If you reverse 16 times, that's going to be more convincing demonstration than if you only reverse once or twice. But the million-dollar question is, do you need to? And of course, these guys who write these books are academics, so they don't think about those practical things. All right, alternating treatments with no baseline. And this is really straightforward, so I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, and if you have any questions, again, we can talk about it next week because we'll have a face-to-face class, or put them in the discussion forum, and I'll answer them that way. But so these alternating treatments with no baseline, the pre-intervention baseline data are not collected. You alternate the treatments. You present them in sort of a random, although, yeah, unpredictable, I would say. It's not technically random. And of course, you know, oftentimes you will have a no treatment condition. So a lot of the contemporary functional analyses that you'll read now, I think in our 520 class last semester, you guys read an article where there's several, where there were just 2 conditions in an alternating treatment design, a treatment condition and a baseline condition that were run together. The advantage is, and I'm getting way ahead of myself, but the advantage is it's quick. It's quicker and easier than doing a reversal, and you don't have to do a reversal necessarily. All right, so here's an example of a no baseline alternating treatment design. These are the conditions that are run. You connect the lines. And you can see that for this one, it was the number of positive statements for Jimmy and Sue, and baseline, no treatment, baseline, and you can see for Jimmy, it's pretty darn low, lower than everything else. A little bit better was verbal praise. That's this line, I think. But the one where it seemed to be the best, you got the most number of positive statements, and it eventually, at first they were all kind of bunched up, which is what you typically see with an alternating treatment design. It takes a while for the individual to discriminate among the conditions rather, and for you to start to see the one of them emerge if that's going to happen. And in Jimmy's case, it did with the verbal praise. So similar thing with Sue, except maybe with Sue the difference between no treatment or baseline and the token was really not much of a difference. In Jimmy's case, baseline was lowest. Here it's about the same, but same thing, same pattern. You started to see emerging the verbal praise as the most effective. So, classic example, like Iwata's, of alternating treatments design. So, you could also have a baseline in there, which again is nice, and here's an example of that. Jimmy and Sue again, and we can add a baseline in there, and here's now the pulled out, the baseline condition. Here's the other two conditions. Okay, basically shows the same patterns. You come up with the same conclusions, and you're probably going to run more sessions doing it this way. You go back and look at the other one, there's a total of less sessions, and also you could have a final treatment phase and add that, which again would make the design certainly stronger. Question is, do you need to? But here it is. So same data, same guys, Jimmy and Sue, same function, except now here's the best one, and yeah, wow, look how different that is than the initial baseline. Of course, if we ran this out, as just one, we also can look and see with a lot less sessions and a lot quicker, look at the difference between baseline and the best condition. But hey, that's why they put options on cars, huh? So let's talk a little bit about the basic logic. Your book is really into talking about this prediction, verification, and replication, and it certainly is, important in the designs. The most important thing is there a functional relationship? But certainly this also demonstrates prediction. As you recall, prediction is you would predict that if there's no difference, all three conditions would look the same. Verification is that if it starts to emerge, you're verifying that one actually is different, which was the case with both Jimmy and Sue. And replication, in this case, is really every additional point that you add. So the more points that you add, and we added a lot more here, this is all your replication. Here we're starting to verify. Here the prediction is everything's going to be the same. We're verifying this one is better. Now we're replicating it with all these subsequent points. Pretty straightforward, I think. So have we demonstrated experimental control? In other words, do we have a functional relationship between the interventions and the target behaviors? And the answer is yes, because it's unlikely that you are going to have some extraneous variables, because you're going back and forth every single time that there's something different about this condition versus the baseline condition or the other condition. So you really are demonstrating control, and you're demonstrating a functional relationship that between this particular intervention and this target behavior. So, like all of these designs, there's some issues with how do you make that determination. Well, one of the things you look at is the degree of overlap, or really the separation of the data paths. So to the extent that they're separated more, that's going to give you more confidence that they're really different. The vertical distance, so how much more, and then the trends, are they going in the right direction? All of that in Jimmy and Sue's case is pretty clear. Other cases it may not be as clear. But here it seems pretty clear. There's pretty good distance in between. There's overlap here. This looks like there's no difference. Small difference here. There's not really overlap, but there's not much of a distance between these two. However, there's a much bigger distance between baseline and the really good one. So what are some of the considerations with alternating treatment designs? One is you got to be careful about multiple treatment interference. So in other words, these interventions have to be independent. You can't use something like, oh, we're going to teach the person to do math, and then with one of the interventions they master math, so then therefore they're demonstrating a mastery of math with each intervention that you put in. That would be multiple treatment interference, the effects of one treatment carrying over to another. You also have to make sure you're counterbalancing those conditions so you don't have any kind of sequence effects. That is, oh, well, this one only works, the alone condition is only the highest if it's followed by the escape condition, or vice versa. You don't and you can easily control for that by counterbalancing and having no predictable order of conducting your sessions. Finally, and this is a bigger issue with alternating treatment designs, is this discrimination of treatments. So when you're doing functional analysis sessions, one of the biggest problems that I've encountered in doing a lot of them over the years is individuals, if you don't get differentiation among the conditions, is it because, well, it doesn't make any difference, or is it that the individual doesn't get it? He doesn't know in this condition, oh, I'm escaping, and he hasn't discriminated that difference. And in this condition, I'm getting attention. So one way to address that, and there are a lot of articles in the literature that have done these things, is people have used multiple researchers and practitioners have used multiple ways of helping the discrimination. That is, you might have one condition is conducted in one room, another condition in another room, or one condition at one desk and another condition at another desk. There's even studies of people who have worn different colored t-shirts, and so therapists, when they're wearing green, it's the escape condition, and when they're wearing blue, it's the attention condition, and when they're wearing yellow, it's the alone condition. People have even painted the colors of the rooms, people who do a lot of these kinds of sessions, and so the t-shirts match the colors of the rooms. But one thing that I typically have done with some success about addressing this issue of discrimination or challenge of discrimination with alternating treatment designs is try to have different people associated with different conditions. I think that's a more real situation, and if to the extent that the data that we're getting in these analog sessions it generalizes to what really is happening in the classroom or in the home, I think has to do with different people are doing different things. So that's another way that you can help to discriminate treatments. So the advantages, well, it's fast. That is the biggest advantage, as I pointed out. You can have a baseline, you can have a treatment, you can do reversals, but this is going to be quicker. There's going to be less conditions that you have to run. We've talked about in class several times that you can do these alternating treatment designs and assessments really quickly in whatever practical setting you're in, is run a couple of conditions. Oh, well, I'm going to, these kids are sitting together and I'm recording non-compliance. And I move them apart and put 3 people in between them, and I record 10 minutes of compliance again. Then I put them back together and I record. you do that 3 or 4 times, and you could do that in an afternoon. That's it. You've done a functional analysis. That is quick and easy. You're not going to be doing any kind of, think about it. If you were trying to do a reversal design with that, you'd have to get stability in one of those conditions. Then you'd have to go back and change it. Then you'd have to get stability in that condition. Then you'd have to go back at least and change it again, which would be, that's the ABA. And then, as we discussed, ABAB, is even better. So you'd have to do it a 4th time. All of that would take a heck of a lot longer than you running a total of 3 or 4, a total of 5 or 6 5-minute or 10-minute sessions in your classroom under regular educational conditions, just by moving the chairs or whatever your intervention might be. So by far the biggest advantage, I'm a huge fan of alternating treatment designs for doing practical kinds of things that we do in our treatment settings. And the biggest advantage is that it is quick. And baseline data is not necessary. Particularly, I would always include a baseline in my alternating treatment. Continuing with advantages, withdrawal of treatment is unnecessary, so you don't have to deal with the ethical, educational concerns we talked about with reversal designs, and it minimizes the potential for sequential effects when you're counterbalancing those conditions sort of back and forth unpredictably. Disadvantages. Well, we talked about the biggest one is one of the biggest ones is multiple treatment interference. So if you're not going to be able to do this with behaviors that where one condition is going to affect the other, it's not really appropriate for behaviors that are going to take a long time to change. Because then its advantage of being quick doesn't make any difference, but that's because the behavior isn't changing. It has a potential for irreversibility, like the math problem that we discussed. Once the individual learns how to do math problems with one condition, then that may affect how they do it in other conditions. Difficulties implementing the treatment adequately, and that's the discrimination kinds of issues we talked about. And that is a challenge, but not an insurmountable one generally. Although sometimes you will see examples of where, and I've worked with these individuals, they never could discriminate in an alternating treatment condition. It was just too fast moving back and forth and back and forth. So we had to do a reversal kind of condition with them. All right, and finally is the artificial nature of the design. We talked about last time the multiple baseline designs, that one of the advantages is, it's a natural kind of way that most non-behaviorist teachers, people who are working with other professionals, it's a way that they think about how they would make changes. Alternating treatment design is bizarre to non-behavioral people, and they just don't understand why you would do it. You do it because it's quick. So finally, adaptation. So there's a lot of adaptations, and I've ranted about this, so I won't keep you too much longer talking about this. But all of these designs, I guess I kind of look at this a little differently than most people, because when I was trained, it was in experimental psychology in the 70s. And we didn't really have names in experimental for reversal and multiple baseline and alternating treatment and changing criteria. We just controlled for extraneous variables, demonstrated functional controls, and therefore the designs were sort of a hybrid and adaptations of all of these. And of course that works. And I think sometimes though, people get so hung up on these designs that they feel like, oh, I really would like to use this kind of design, but I can't. Of course you can. You can combine designs. There's a limitless number of adaptations for all of these. The important thing is you're demonstrating control. The design you use doesn't have to have a name, but generally they do. And these are the ones that we're discussing are the ones that are used 98% of the time. So one of the more popular adaptations is the concurrent operand schedule or simultaneous treatments. And I think we've talked about this before in other examples. I can't remember if it was in this class or in the 520 class, but maybe both. But, examples where you want to quickly figure out what's going on. So you might have, okay, at this desk, you're going to do math problems, and there's going to be this consequence. And if you sit over here at this desk and do the same math problems, there's going to be these other consequences. Well, it sounds like, and it very much sounds like an alternating treatment design, but technically it's not because it's simultaneous treatments, because both of those treatments are in effect at the same time, and the individual gets to choose which one he or she wants to use, as opposed to, okay, we're going to do this one, and we're going to see how many math problems you do under these conditions versus those conditions. Hopefully that's clear, but that is a adaptation and something that's a little bit different. Concurrent operand schedules, I think, are a very cool thing. Technically, they are not alternating treatment designs because they are simultaneous. The treatments are presented simultaneously. Now, I feel like these designs are presented pretty clearly in the book, and this, of course, is a new edition. I've used the older edition of this book in the past, and students have liked it. Actually, they like it more than I like it, but I think they like it because it's simple, and I'll grant you that. And the focus really is on educational and clinical kinds of settings. So I feel like they do a pretty good job of explaining this. So that's why I'm going through these kind of quickly. So let's go to changing criterion design. Okay, so in the changing criterion design, this is kind of interesting. In the changing criterion design, you evaluate the effects of a treatment based on the gradual increase or decrease of a target behavior. After the baseline phases are introduced, criterion levels are changed in a stepwise fashion. So, for example, this is used primarily in things like weight loss or programs to get people to stop smoking cigarettes. For example, let's use cigarettes because it's a great example. So you'd start off with a baseline. If I smoke 25 cigarettes a day, and you'd say, okay, your goal now is to reduce down to 15 cigarettes a day, and whatever the criterion intervention is that I'm working on. And then once I attained whatever that criterion was, that is, for 1 week or 1 day or 1 month, I maintained my cigarette consumption at 15, then it might get decreased down to 12, and then down to 8, and you got the picture. So now here's an example of, we're talking about increasing a behavior, number of math problems completed. So here's the baseline. So this guy was averaged about 7 math problems. So here, the solid dark line here is the goal. So we said, okay, he was averaging about 7, so we're going to say 8, because that's certainly in his repertoire. He's got to do 8, and if he does 8, then we're going to buy him a pony or whatever the intervention is. And you can see he did pretty well. He stayed pretty close to 8. Then we said, great, now he's got to do 11. Great, and he matched it. Now you got to do 14, and he matched it. Now you got to do 17, and he matched it. Now you got to do 20, and he matched it. This is how you're demonstrating control, because you're changing the criteria, changing criterion design. You're changing the criteria, and to the extent that the individual matches that change, you're demonstrating control. Now, in the real world, let me say that differently. Getting people to stop smoking or lose weight is certainly real world problems also. But working more with the kinds of things that I think most of us work with, which are, kids who are engaging in maladaptive behaviors, you don't see a lot of changing criterion designs, and we'll talk about that why. Now here's some real data from a long time ago that I collected with a kid who engaged in what I will call annoying sounds, but just trust me, these were incredibly annoying sounds where he would drive people crazy. So here was the baseline, and this was kids with brain injuries, and the other kids would go crazy, and the place would be a zoo within about 5 or 10 minutes after this guy got in the classroom, typically because of these annoying sounds. So he was doing it during a classroom. I can't remember how long a period this was for, but so he was averaging, sort of the range is all over the place, but I don't know, 8 times a class or something with these annoying sounds. So we put a big fat contingency in place where he could earn all these great things if he did it 5 or less times, because didn't think he could go down to 0. Here's 5, and you can see, for the most part, he stuck with 5, 5, below 5. One time went over 5, realized he didn't earn it. So that was great. So then we said, great, we're going to go down to 3 times. Well, he did great. Then he lost it, which, by the way, this is one of the downsides of working with aberrant behaviors with this kind of design, which is, well, heck, once you go over, you've already lost the criteria, so you might as well have a field day and do it 30 times, because the criteria is not going to change. Then we went down to once, and he did 1 good day, then he tested us out. That didn't work out. And for the most part, he stayed at 1 or less. So kind of demonstrated. The problem with this is that some people would say that you need to, and your book talks a little bit about this, but not gets into much detail, but that sometimes you need to demonstrate, in order, you have a huge sequence effect here, that gradually over time, maybe this was just going to decrease over time. But to the extent that it matches the behavior, And here it really isn't matching it. How different are some of these from this? It doesn't really demonstrate control. That sometimes you may want to put a baseline back in periodically just to demonstrate that the behavior goes up again, to demonstrate control. But this is one of the reasons you're not going to see a lot of changing criterion designs, and I had to hunt to find some examples of changing criterion designs for us to read. Here's another example for coin counting that I have done in the past that are real data. Again, you see that the real data aren't quite as clean with the changing criterion design as the data that are in the book. Again, they would be if you're smoking cigarettes. So, for example, if I can smoke, you tell me I can smoke 15 cigarettes a day, well, you can bet your life if I'm addicted to nicotine, I'm going to get those 15 in. I'm not going to just drop down to 1 or 2 cigarettes someday. No, I'm going to get all 15 in. So I'm going to match that exactly. But with aberrant behaviors, or in this case it was really a compliance kind of issue, we don't necessarily see that, so it's harder. So in any case, the red line is the criterion. You can see it goes up and down, which demonstrates control, but it was based on the person's behavior. If they were having trouble meeting it, then we would drop the criterion down. So it did go up and down and finally made it up. But there's so much variability. Generally, this is kind of matching. But it really, it doesn't match it entirely. And I had one study rejected by a journal that I used a changing criterion design like this because there wasn't a reversal and because the behavior didn't match it one-to-one quite as closely. So, sometimes I think you do have to think about with a changing criterion design, you need to demonstrate some kind of control. All right, so you operationally define the target behavior, you collect baseline data, you determine the criterion levels, and you implement the intervention. Pretty straightforward. Now, when you use it, and we've talked a lot about this already, obviously the behavior has to be in the subject's repertoire because you're going to increase it or decrease it somewhat. And the target behavior has to be able to change in a stepwise or gradual fashion. So that's where the challenges come in. Now, obviously, you can't use it if it's not in the person's repertoire, or sometimes if you have a reluctance to hold back performance. That is, you wouldn't want to do this with a dangerous aggression or self-injurious behavior, for example, because you don't want to just gradually change that. You want to really try to eliminate it as quickly as possible. So, the mechanics. I'm going to get into this, make this more complicated than it has to sound. Your book talks about this quite a bit, but the question is, how fast, how slow do you go? And really, in all of these single subject designs, a lot of it has to do with what's convincing, what's practical, what can you do. Small changes for more stable data, some people say. The book says large changes for more variable data. How long each subphase should be. You need to have stable responding. The criteria for like that coin study I just showed you, I think the criteria was he had to have 2 or 3 days in a row that he made the criteria before we moved on to the next one. All right, more on that. Again, this baseline logic that we just talked about, prediction, verification, replication, it certainly meets the requirements of that. The prediction would be that the individual's behavior would continue not to change. So to the extent that it does match what the criteria is, then you've got verification, and every time you increase it, decrease it, and that behavior changes, you have replication. Whoops. Now, the big question, as I mentioned, is a functional relationship really evident? And as I said, some people would say not, if you're just going to go in a stepwise fashion, unless you go down or go up or even have maybe a baseline condition again in order to really demonstrate control. Then really you have all of the conditions of a reversal design. Other people are fine with just showing this stepwise control. I personally, I don't know where I fall on that. All right, baseline prediction, we talked about that. Is experimental control demonstrated? Does the data reflect differential effects? If the responding during the intervention is different compared to baseline, is there evidence that the different levels of responding are predictably and reliably produced by the different criterion levels? And generally, with the data that I've shown, that's true. Some of the real data are a little harder to interpret. Again, I think that's one of the weaknesses of this design, is it really doesn't work so well with decreasing maladaptive behaviors, in my experience. All right, so yeah, here's a pretty nice demonstration of, I think, everything, including functional control. So you've got a little reversal to a previous condition, and the person's behavior drops. So in my cigarette, well, this is more, but in the math, this is the math problems one. So now we're saying, okay, well, you only really have to do 15 to get this intervention, this reward, if you will, and the person drops to 15 instead of staying at 17. Great, you've demonstrated control, and it's not a complete reversal. You're not dropping it out, but you're demonstrating a functional relationship. I think this is clearly a stronger design, and if you're going to use a changing criterion design, you need to use some demonstrate some kind of control with a reversal to a previous criterion level. All right, so the advantages are that it's pretty straightforward. A withdrawal of the whole intervention isn't necessary to demonstrate a functional relationship. It is really pretty straightforward. And we've talked about these adaptations. You can reverse to a previous criterion level or reinstate the baseline conditions. And of course the disadvantages are, and I don't know what happened to the disadvantages. Where are the disadvantages? But the disadvantages are that sometimes it just isn't easy to do. There are certain behaviors, I think, that are not going to lend themselves to specifically changing in a stepwise fashion. And as we talked about, the other big disadvantage, or the times that you're not going to be using this kind of design, is when you don't want to do it in a gradual fashion, where you really just want the behavior to end immediately. So that's it for changing criterion design and alternating treatment. So we will, for this week, read, or hopefully you've already read, chapters 7 and 11 in Richards. After reading them and hearing this, if you've got some questions, either put them in the discussion format, or we will get together next week, face-to-face class, and we can talk about those. And then next week in our face-to-face class, you guys will be presenting some examples of alternating treatment designs or changing criterion designs. So for next week, you're going to read the Lerman article, the Payton article, and the DeLuca and Holborn article. And you guys have already been assigned who will be presenting those articles. But again, please read all three so that we can have a good discussion of these articles. All right, have a great week, and I will see you next week.